There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. That is the premise of the movie The Matrix. Very scary stuff. Leopold Aschenbrenne is a former OpenAI employee who got fired for apparently leaking information, but what he says is that he was just warning the board about their severe lack of safety and security protocols within the company. And then he put together a 165-page manifesto talking about what he believes is the future of not only hitting AGI by 2027, but then achieving super intelligence by the end of this decade. And he says very few people are actually aware of what is coming. And I read all 165 pages, and I'm going to break the whole thing down for you. All right, so here it is. Leopold Aschenbrenne, Situational Awareness, the decade ahead. I read through everything, and I highlighted the most important bits. So let's get into it. First and foremost, dedicated to Ilya Sutskever, who I believe Ilya and Leopold were the ones who really kicked off this going to the board and telling them about all of their security concerns. So he dedicated this entire thing to Ilya. And he also gave a thank you to Jan Leike and Ilya again. And if you remember, Jan is somebody who just left OpenAI with Ilya just about a couple weeks ago over the same security concerns. So obviously I'm not going to read this whole thing, but especially in the introduction, there are a lot of really interesting bits, so I'm going to try to cover it all. Over the past year, the talk of the town being San Francisco, has shifted from $10 billion compute clusters to $100 billion compute clusters to $1 trillion clusters. Every 6 months, a zero is added to the boardroom plans. And that is something that we're seeing. The explosion of NVIDIA stock, the massive acquisition of GPUs by leading tech companies is unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of technology. And one thing that I haven't thought a lot about is the power needed to power all of this compute. And it seems like behind the scenes, there is a fierce scramble to secure every power contract still available for the rest of the decade. And we're going to touch a lot more on the power consumption, how we're going to power all of these massive server farms. American big business is gearing up to pour trillions of dollars into a long unseen mobilization of American industrial might. By the end of the decade, American electricity production will have grown tens of %. That is crazy to think about. All of these compute clusters being built out need electricity. They feed on electricity. That is how they run. And we literally do not have enough electricity in the United States currently to power everything that we're going to need to power to reach AGI and superintelligence. The AGI race has begun. Now for his predictions, by 2025, 2026, these machines will outpace college graduates. We're basically almost there. By the end of the decade, they will be smarter than you or I. We will have superintelligence in the true sense of the word. And to be clear, he defines superintelligence as what is beyond AGI. AGI is one thing. Superintelligence is another. And I'm going to show you what that's all about soon. It's kind of scary to think about. Along the way, national security forces not seen in half a century will be unleashed. And before long, quote unquote, the project will be on. And I will get to what the project is and what it entails later on. If we're lucky, we'll be in an all-out race with the CCP, that is the government of China. If we're unlucky, an all-out war. And to be clear, he is extremely concerned with the CCP and them as an adversary to the US within the context of AGI and superintelligence. In fact, if we take a look at this Business Insider article about him getting fired, he says, I ruffled some feathers. Aschenbrenne said he wrote a memo after a major security incident. He didn't specify what it was. He shared it with a couple OpenAI board members. And then he wrote that the company's security was egregiously insufficient in protecting against theft of key algorithmic secrets from foreign actors. Human resources at OpenAI then gave him a warning about the memo, telling him it was racist and unconstructive to worry about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, who knows if this is actually true? This is the Business Insider's report coming from Leopold himself. I don't know, but either way, to think that worrying about the CCP hacking US private entities is racist. I mean, this happens and has happened many, many times. We've lost a lot of intellectual property due to exactly that. Now back to his paper. He says that everyone is talking about AI, but few have the faintest glimmer of what is about to hit them. So he is very much in the camp that we're going to have an intelligence explosion. He believes AGI is coming very soon, and shortly behind that, superintelligence that we might not be able to control. Then he talks about the naysayers. NVIDIA analysts still think 2024 might be close to the peak. Mainstream pundits are stuck on the willful blindness of it's just predicting the next word, and that is in reference to how transformers work. Currently, large language models do just predict the next word, but if you scale that up enough, that may become superintelligence. At most, they entertain another internet-scale technological change. Before long, the world will wake up. And he says there are only a few hundred people, most of them in San Francisco and the AI labs, that have situational awareness. And that, again, is the title of this paper. Situational awareness, meaning they actually understand what is coming. All right, so in chapter 1, from GPT-4 to AGI, counting the OOMs. And the OOMs are orders of magnitude. Those are 10x changes in either compute or intelligence, whatever we're measuring, that is an order of magnitude change. AGI by 2027 is strikingly possible. That is right around the corner. GPT-2 to GPT-4 took us from preschooler to smart high schooler abilities in 4 years. Tracing trend lines in compute, so 0.5 orders of magnitude per year. Algorithmic efficiencies, another 0.5 orders of magnitude per year. And unhobbling gains, from chatbot to agent, we should expect another preschooler to high schooler size qualitative jump by 2027. And I will explain what all of this means through this paper. He starts by saying GPT-4's capabilities came as a shock to many. And that is true. I don't think anybody was really understanding how powerful these systems were. I think a lot of people were shocked by GPT 3.5. Not a lot of people understood what is possible with large language models. But GPT-4 was merely the continuation of a decade of breakneck progress in deep learning. A decade earlier, so just 10 years earlier, models could barely identify simple images of cats and dogs. 4 years earlier, GPT-2 could barely string together semi-plausible sentences. Now, we are rapidly saturating all the benchmarks we can come up with. And yet this dramatic progress has merely been the result of consistent trends in scaling up deep learning. Now, that is what a lot of people say. If we just continue to scale up large language models, we can reach AGI and beyond. Yann LeCun and the team at Meta is of a different thought. They do not believe that the underlying architecture behind transformers, behind large language models, is enough to scale up and reach AGI and beyond. And what happens when we hit AGI? That's when we will have the explosion of artificial intelligence. But why? How does that actually happen because of AGI? And again, AGI itself isn't the explosion in intelligence. That just means that artificial intelligence is good enough to do things better than humans on average. So let's see. I make the following claim. It is strikingly plausible that by 2027, models will be able to do the work of an AI researcher engineer. That doesn't require believing in sci-fi. It just requires believing in straight lines on a graph. Here it is. This is the effective compute on the y-axis normalized to GPT-4, and then this is the timeline on the x-axis. As we see here, this is where we've been. All of a sudden, we have crossed over this GPT-4 line, and we will continue all the way up to here, where automated AI researcher. Why is that the mark, though? Why is that the benchmark that we have to measure against? Well, if AI is as smart or smarter than an AI researcher and engineer, then all of a sudden we can deploy hundreds of them, thousands of them, millions of them, all working 24 hours a day in parallel, doing research and compounding the effects of that research and that development of AI. So it is this sudden explosion in our ability to find a new research, develop that research, and then deploy that research. Here is something really interesting that I found. Publicly, things have been quiet for a year since the GPT-4 release, as the next generation of models has been in the oven, leading some to proclaim stagnation and that deep learning is hitting a wall. And Gary Marcus is one of those people who thinks that large language models have hit a wall. But by counting the OOMs, orders of magnitude, we get a peek at what we should actually expect. All right, so then he continues to talk about the leap from GPT-2 to GPT-4, and it was not a one-time gain. We are racing through OOMs extremely rapidly, and the numbers indicate we should expect another 100,000x effective compute scale-up, resulting in another GPT-2 to GPT-4 size qualitative jump over 4 years. 4 years. That's crazy. And that doesn't just mean a better chatbot. Gains should take us from chatbots to agents. Of course, you know I'm very bullish on agents. From a tool to something that looks more like a drop-in remote worker replacement. Another jump like that very well could take us to AGI, to models as smart as PhDs or experts that can work beside us as coworkers. Perhaps most importantly, if these AI systems could automate AI research itself, that would set in motion intense feedback loops that I've been describing so far. That I hadn't thought enough about. The fact that the second we create something that can iterate on itself and actually do research on making itself better, that feedback loop is going to be insane. And that's kind of the premise of the movie The Matrix. Even now, barely anyone is pricing all this in. So let's take a second and let's talk about the progress to date. So we have GPT-2 in 2019. Can you believe that, by the way? 2019, just 5 years ago. Preschooler, wow, it can string together a few plausible sentences. GPT-2 could barely count to 5 without getting tripped up. So here's the example. And this is from the GPT-2 paper. You can check it out yourself, but it's just an example of GPT-2 having reading comprehension. Then GPT-3 in 2020, elementary schooler. Wow, with just some few shot examples, it can do some simple, useful tasks. It was also commercially useful in a few narrow ways. For example, GPT-3 could generate simple copy for SEO and marketing. And here it's showing what was very impressive at the time. So a few examples, including a little coding example with CSS, it looks like. Then GPT-4 in 2023, a smart high schooler. Wow, it can write some pretty sophisticated code and iteratively debug. It can write intelligently and sophisticatedly about complicated topics. It can reason through difficult high school competition math. It's beating the vast majority of high schoolers on whatever tests we can give it. And then again, some examples. And these are crazy complex examples that in my mind are beyond high schoolers. But GPT-4, as it says here, is still somewhat uneven. For some tasks, it's much better than smart high schoolers, while there are other tasks it can't yet do. One perfect example of that is give me 10 sentences that end in the word apple. In fact, probably an 8-year-old can do that. But because of the way that transformers work, it really struggles with questions like that. Basically, anything with planning, it really struggles with. So here we go. Here's the timeline: preschooler, elementary schooler, smart high schooler, and then what is next. Now, let's take a look at this graph here. This is kind of insane. So all the way back to 1998, we can see how long this progress took. And these are just different benchmarks that they measured artificial intelligence against. So you can see how long it took to get better. But then all of a sudden, right around 2016, we started to have this explosion in capabilities. And all of these trend lines are going directly vertical. Their improvement is substantial. And here's an example from GPT 3.5, which was 2022, to GPT 4, which is 2023. Here are their performance in a bunch of different exams, from the bar exam, LSAT, SAT, GRE, etc. Look at GPT 3.5, 10th percentile, 40th percentile, 87th percentile. But now look at GPT 4. I mean, the GRE verbal, 99th percent. The bar exam, 90th percent, the LSAT, 88th percent, SAT, 97th percent. So really outperforming humans on most of these tests on average. And then he goes on to talk about the skeptics. Over and over again, year after year, skeptics have claimed deep learning won't be able to do X and have been quickly proven wrong. With the example, here's Jan LeCun again. Jan LeCun is the head of Meta AI, predicting in 2022 that even GPT-5000 won't be able to reason about physical interactions with the real world. GPT-4 obviously does it with ease a year later. Now, I don't necessarily believe that. It does not do it with ease. And Jan LeCun gave some really good examples of GPT-4 not being able to be a world model in itself. And I made an entire video about it where he had a discussion with Lex Friedman. Check out that video. And Jan LeCun believes that we're going to need some additional technology in addition to transformers to actually reach a true world model. He's been inventing something called, I believe, VJEPA, and so you can also check that out. Here, Gary Marcus, walls predicted after GPT-2 being solved by GPT-3, and the walls he predicted after GPT-3 being solved by GPT-4. And so on. Now, the hardest unsolved benchmarks are tests like GPQA, a set of PhD level biology, chemistry, and physics questions. Many of the questions read like gibberish to me, and even PhDs in other scientific fields spending 30 minutes plus with Google barely score above random chance. Claude 3 Opus currently gets 60% right near instantly. Kind of nuts. Here is another example where just scaling up compute had incredible results. So this is the 3 examples of different computes based on Sora. And Sora is the text-to-video generation model by OpenAI. Here is the base compute, and you can see one screenshot from this video. You can barely tell what's going on. Then with 4x compute, you know it's a dog. There's a person in the background. Then 32 times compute, a highly detailed video, very precise. I don't see any mistakes or hallucinations in this video. So really showing how just strictly scaling up compute can lead to incredible results. With each OOM of effective compute, models predictably, reliably get better. So he talks about the progress of GPTs and AI in general and breaks them down into 3 categories. So let's go over these because I think these are really interesting. Number 1 is compute. We're building more GPUs, we're building better GPUs, and there's just going to be more compute out in the world. And if you throw compute at these models, they get better. 2, algorithmic efficiencies, which I think kind of fly under the radar of people understanding how a simple algorithmic efficiency can result in huge gains. And then finally, unhobbling gains. So with simple algorithmic improvements like reinforcement learning from human feedback, chain of thought, tools, and scaffolding, we can unlock significant latent capabilities. Unhobbling gains, another word for that is agents. So he's talking about a lot of things that we do with agents today as the unhobbling gains. So chain of thought, or having multiple agents working together, being able to use tools, being able to use scaffolding. So yeah, unhobbling is a big way to unlock gains. Now let's go into depth about compute. When Moore's law was in its heyday, it was comparatively glacial, perhaps 1 to 1.5 OOMs per decade. We are seeing much more rapid scale-ups in compute, close to 5x the speed of Moore's law, instead because of mammoth investment. Now, whether that investment is going to pay off is yet to be seen, but we've seen NVIDIA stock price skyrocket. That is because every major tech company is buying up GPUs as quickly as they can, and they are putting in place the infrastructure for AI down the road. Now, here's the thing. We've spent so much money on GPUs as a country and in the world as a whole, yet the revenues from artificial intelligence and that investment only is in the order of tens of billions of dollars, and most of which is captured by OpenAI currently. Next, I want to touch on this. The SF rumor mill, San Francisco, is abreast with dramatic tales of huge GPU orders. An additional 2 OOMs of compute, a cluster in the tens of billions, seems very likely to happen by the end of 2027. Even a cluster closer to plus 3 OOMs of compute, $100 billion, seems plausible and is rumored to be in the works at Microsoft OpenAI. Now, we've already heard the rumors that Sam Altman is raising $7 trillion for compute. So the next order of magnitude is certainly there. Now let's talk about algorithmic efficiencies. Algorithmic progress is probably a similarly important driver of progress. Here's an example. Here's the relative inference cost of a 50% performance on the math benchmark. So in July 2022, we had the relative cost, I believe this is in tokens, Minerva 540B all the way up there, GPT-4 much lower, and then Gemini 1.5 Flash with few-shot, very inexpensive now. So the cost of running inference on these models is dropping dramatically. Inference efficiency improved by nearly 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000 times in less than 2 years. And he says that there are 2 kinds of algorithmic progress. Those that simply result in better base models and that straightforwardly act as compute efficiencies or compute multipliers. For example, a better algorithm might allow us to achieve the same performance but with 10x less training compute. And both of those things are equally important. Here he goes on to describe the price drop of GPT-4. So since the GPT-4 release a year ago, OpenAI prices for GPT-4 level models have fallen another 6 or 4x for input and output with the release of GPT-4o. Gemini 1.5 Flash, recently released, offers between GPT 3.75 level and GPT-4 level performance while costing 85 and 57x less input to output than the original GPT-4. Then he goes on to talk about mixture of experts, which we've talked about at length on this channel, and how you can have these massive models, but then the inference only uses a fraction of the active model. And so that is another huge inference and algorithmic gain. So put together, public information suggests that the GPT-2 to GPT-4 jump included 1 to 2 orders of magnitude algorithmic efficiency gains. And we can see that here. While compute efficiencies will become harder to find as we pick the low-hanging fruit, AI lab investments in money and talent to find new algorithmic improvements are growing rapidly. So even though we're kind of taking all that low-hanging fruit and algorithmic efficiencies, and it will become harder and harder to find those gains, our investment to find those gains are outstripping the rate at which we're losing the ability to find gains, if that makes sense. Now let's talk about another problem that a lot of people are talking about, the data wall, which basically means we're running out of data. And if you watch this channel at all, you already know where we're going to go with this, synthetic data, but let's talk about it. There is a potentially important source of variance for all of this. We're running out of internet data. That could mean that very soon a naive approach to pre-training larger language models on more scraped data could start hitting serious bottlenecks. Basically, all of the most modern frontier models have used all of the internet's data. There is no more data. And as I've said a lot in the past, looking at private or proprietary data sets like X, like Reddit, Google, Apple, these data sets are going to increase in value very, very quickly. And that could be a differentiation between different AI organizations. So here it says Llama 3 was trained on 15 trillion tokens, Common Crawl, and lists a few other things. Then he goes on to say you can go somewhat further by repeating the data, but academic work on this suggests that repetition only gets you so far. Repeating the data meaning look at the data over and over again. But there are other things to think about when we're thinking about this limit on data. This isn't to be understated. We've been riding the scaling curves, riding the wave of the language modeling pre-training paradigm, and without something new here, this paradigm will, at least naively, run out, despite the massive investments we've plateau. All of the AI labs are rumored to be making massive research bets on new algorithmic improvements or approaches to get around this. Researchers are purportedly trying many strategies, from synthetic data to self-play and RL approaches. Now, synthetic data, we've talked about, that just means using one model to create a bunch of data for another model. And I'm not so sure that that is a long-term solution. But what could be a long-term solution, and something that Sam Altman has talked about, is actually being able to do a lot more with your existing data. He also talks about self-play here. And if you remember AlphaGo, which is Google's AI that learned to play Go better than any human, it basically just started with learning the rules of the game and then created its own synthetic data. And in this example, it works well because it just played games over and over with itself. And every time it won, it would use that to train the model. Every time it lost, it would use that as a negative signal. And it played thousands and millions of games until it got to the point where it was better than humans. And so that could be another technique that we use. But one thing that Sam Altman said, and one thing that also Leopold is saying, is it should be possible to find ways to train models with much better sample efficiency. So taking that existing set of data and getting more out of it. And he gives a really good analogy for how that would work. Consider how you or I would learn from a really dense math textbook. So what modern LLMs do during training is essentially very, very quickly skim the textbook, the words just flying by, not spending much brain power on it. Rather, when you or I read that math textbook, we read a couple pages slowly, then have an internal monologue about the material in our head and talk about it with a few study buddies. Read another page or two, then try some practice problems. Fail, try them again in a different way, get some feedback on those problems, try again until we get the problem right, and so on. And then eventually the material just clicks. That is not how transformers work. We just give it a bunch of data, it looks at it once, and then it tries to guess the next token, and it just doesn't really think about the information at all. So imagine we could apply this new learning technique to large language models, and they would actually think and go over the same data over and over again. They would be able to get so much more out of the existing data sets. And there is also a lot of garbage data on the internet. So just being able to curate and having higher quality data sets and getting more out of those data sets could unlock huge performance gains. So here he talks about that. Current frontier models like Llama 3 are trained on the internet, and the internet is mostly crap, like e-commerce or SEO or whatever. Many LLMs spend the vast majority of their training compute on this crap rather than on the really high quality data. Imagine if you could spend GPT-4 level compute on entirely extremely high quality data. It could be much more capable model. And then here he explains how that could actually be a differentiator for different AI labs. This also means that we should expect more variance between the different labs in the coming years compared to today, which is a great thing. Basically, all of these models are becoming commoditized, and that is something that I deeply believed, but maybe after reading this, I don't believe it as much as I did. Up until recently, the state-of-the-art techniques were published, so everyone was basically doing the same thing on the same data set. And then he goes on to say, if everybody is figuring out new techniques for leveraging the same amount of data, whoever has the best techniques, the best algorithms is going to win, and that's a differentiator. Now, open source will have a much harder time competing, because if you're having these huge algorithmic gains internally, he's saying that these AI labs probably won't want to share that. Whether that's true or not, I'm not so sure, because a lot of these researchers like their work being out there. So again, let's have a thought experiment. Imagine if when asked to solve a hard math problem, you had to instantly answer with the very first thing that came to mind. That's basically how LLMs solve math. Most of us problem solve through step-by-step, and we're able to give a little bit of that step-by-step strategy to large language models with chain of thought reasoning. And even with that, it's still not great. Here he talks about the different potential algorithmic gains. We've already talked about RLHF. We've talked about chain of thought, scaffolding, which is chain of thought plus, rather than just asking the model to solve a problem. Have one model, have a plan of attack, another propose a bunch of possible solutions. He's basically describing agents. Then we have tools. Again, agents use tools, so that's external math libraries, that's searching the internet, etc. And then context length improvements will also help us improve the models themselves. And then post-training improvements. So he talks about how GPT-4 in its current state is a lot different from the original GPT-4 that came out. Another way he describes large language models as being hobbled is they do not have long-term memory. They can't use a computer. They still mostly don't think before they speak. They can only engage in short back and forth dialogues rather than going away for a day or a week thinking about the problem, and they are mostly not personalized to you or your application. And here, let's wrap it up. By 2027, rather than a chatbot, you're going to have something that looks more like an agent, more like a coworker. Now, to get from this chatbot to an agent coworker, he talks about a few things. One is solving the onboarding problem. Every time that you release a model or you start to use a new model, it's essentially just a raw model that knows nothing about you. So it's kind of like hiring somebody new every single time. Now, if we had an automated way to give models all of the information about your company, about yourself, to help them quote unquote onboard, that would be a huge time saver. And I think what he's describing is basically just RAG, because he says being able to have very long context to onboard models to basically feed in all of this additional information, all this context is good, but I think RAG is also a great solution to that. Then he says the test time compute overhang. And basically what that means is when we give a model a prompt, it comes back to us immediately. If we allowed them, and this takes a technological unlock, if we allowed them to take our prompt and go back and think about it, actually spend time on it, days or weeks, maybe a timeline we define, they hypothetically would come back with something that is much more effective and higher quality. Now, I've talked about this iterative loop that models can take, and this is something that I wrote. So let me try to explain something that I've attempted in the past. I've tried to take a model, give it a prompt, let's say write 10 sentences that end in the word apple. So it does that, and let's say it fails one of them. I take the response and I simply repackage it in another prompt, give it back and say, are you sure? Make sure all of them end in the word apple. And if not, please iterate and give me a better answer. And every single time you do this without some kind of external feedback mechanism, there's no way for the model to understand it made a mistake. Every single time I've done this, it says, yeah, that's right. It looks right to me. Now, there's ways around this. With coding, for example, you can iterate on coding really easily because the model will provide code, you'll run the code, and then you'll provide back either a success or any errors that you see. And that's why large language models are able to iterate on code so well. But on other things that don't have this external validation, it's nearly impossible for a large language model's answer to improve just by asking it again or to check its work. They could also have different large language models checking each other's work, and maybe one is better than another. But even then, some external feedback is necessary. Then he also describes large language models being able to use a computer. ChatGPT right now is basically like a human that sits in an isolated box that you can text. We will simply enable models to use a computer like a human would. So why not? Why can't it search the internet? Why can't it write code and execute code. And again, that's what agents are. That means joining your Zoom calls, researching things online, messaging and emailing people, reading shared docs, using your apps and dev tooling, and so on. Something I really believe in. A model in itself, by itself, independently, is never going to be as powerful as if it had access to tools. But now let's move past all of this and talk about what actually happens when models can do AI research themselves. Once models can automate AI research itself, that's enough. Enough to kick off intense feedback loops, and we could very quickly make further progress, the automated AI engineers themselves solving all the remaining bottlenecks to fully automate everything. In particular, millions of automated researchers could very plausibly compress a decade of further algorithmic progress into a year or less. AGI will merely be a small taste of the superintelligence soon to follow, and more on that in the next chapter, and we're going to touch a lot on that. All right, chapter 2, from AGI to superintelligence, the intelligence explosion. AI progress won't stop at human level. Hundreds of millions of AGIs could automate AI research, compressing a decade of algorithmic progress into 1 year. We would rapidly go from human level to vastly superhuman AI systems. The power and the peril of superintelligence would be dramatic. All right, then this is a quote from I.J. Good in 1965, where he's basically describing the matrix. Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of those intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. That is the premise of the movie The Matrix. Very scary stuff. I'm just going to read that last sentence again. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. Okay, so next, the bomb and the super. So I'm not going to get too deep into what he's talking about here, but he basically compares the nuclear bomb to what we're experiencing now with artificial intelligence. And specifically, he says that going from nothing to having that first nuclear bomb was just a baby step, but going from the bomb to the hydrogen, the super bombs, was just as important, if not more important, than actually discovering that first bomb. And that's because the increase in energy, the increase in devastation between the bomb and the hydrogen bomb was so dramatic as compared to having nothing to just the bomb. So here he talks about that discovery of the first atomic bomb, but then just 7 years later, Teller's hydrogen bomb multiplied yields 1,000-fold once again. A single bomb with more explosive power than all of the bombs dropped in the entirety of World War II combined. And that is what he's saying is the difference between getting to AGI and then super intelligence. Once we get to AGI, we won't just have one AGI. I'll walk through the numbers later, but given inference GPU fleets by then, we'll likely be able to run many millions of them, perhaps 100 million human equivalents, and soon after at 10x plus human speed. So he's saying all of these millions or hundreds of millions of AI researchers will be improving itself, self-improvement. And that is the intelligence explosion. So here is a graph, a potential scenario for the intelligence explosion. We have a pretty linear improvement right here. And then all of a sudden we have AGI discovered or AI researchers discovered, and then super intelligence or the automated AI research just explodes. Now, here's something that I've touched on in the past. If we have AI systems that are just vastly smarter than humans, at a certain point, we're not even going to be able to understand what they are, how they work. We already don't understand how large language models work and the inside of them. It's basically a black box. But imagine they get so sophisticated that we can't even begin to understand how they're working, why they make certain decisions. That is basically just handing over complete trust to these AI systems. Here's an example I like to give. Let's think about coding. The way that coding looks today, it looks like natural language. And the reason it looks like natural language is because humans are really bad at coding. So it has to look like natural language to help us. But in the future, if large language models are writing all of our code, it doesn't have to look like natural language. It can look like anything. It could be ones and zeros only. It could be symbols. It could be something we can't even imagine. So that is what he is describing now. Applying superintelligence to R&D in other fields, explosive progress would broaden from just ML research. Soon they'd solve robotics, make dramatic leaps across other fields of science and technology within years. And an industrial explosion would follow. Superintelligence would likely provide a decisive military advantage and unfold untold powers of destruction. We will be faced with one of the most intense and volatile moments of human history. Here he goes on to describe that AI research can be done by AI itself. And once that happens, that is the kickoff to that explosion of intelligence. So let's even dive into that a little deeper. In addition to their raw quantitative advantage, automated AI researchers will have other enormous advantages over human researchers. They'll be able to read every single ML paper ever written and have been able to deeply think about every single previous experiment ever run at the lab. And in parallel, learn from each other. They'll be easily able to write millions of lines of complex code, keep the entire code base in context, and spend human decades checking and rechecking every line of code for bugs and optimizations. You won't have to individually train up each automated AI researcher. Instead, you can just teach and onboard one of them and then make replicas. And then vast numbers of automated AI researchers will be able to share context, enabling much more efficient collaboration and coordination compared to human researchers. Very scary stuff. Here he talks about possible bottlenecks to this envisioned future. I'm just going to touch on it. I'm not going to dive into it too much. Limited compute. Obviously, if we're not able to build out our computing infrastructure fast enough for whatever reason, energy or silicon, we're not going to be able to achieve this. Then he talks about the long tail. So basically, after we get all the low-hanging fruit, all of that additional research and discovery costs a lot more to discover, meaning it takes a lot more compute to get there, to get additional gains. And then there may be inherent limits to algorithmic progress. Okay, now let's move on to what superintelligence actually means and why it's so powerful, why it's going to change the world according to Leopold. Whether or not you agree with the strongest form of these arguments, whether we can get a less than 1 year of intelligence explosion or it takes a few years, it is clear we must confront the possibility of superintelligence. The AI systems we'll likely have by the end of this decade will be unimaginably powerful. So here is human progress, here's time, and what does it feel like to stand here right before this explosion? So what happens when intelligence explodes? Well, it's going to be applied to many fields and it's going to be able to improve itself. Then they're going to solve robotics, something that a lot of people don't think is solvable in the near future. But then we're going to have AI solve robotics and then AI design robotics factories. Then those factories are essentially robots producing other robots. Have you ever played Factorio? And then we will dramatically accelerate scientific and technological progress. We will have an industrial and economic explosion. Extremely accelerated technological progress combined with the ability to automate all human labor could dramatically accelerate economic growth. Self-replicating robot factories quickly covering all of the Nevada desert. Why he chose Nevada, I don't know. Fine. So let's look at this chart. This is the growth mode: hunting, farming, science, industry, and then superintelligence. Here's where we began to dominate it. And then here is how long it took doubling time of the global economy. So hunting, 2 million BC, took us 230 years. Then, as you can see, drastically drops 860 years, 58 years, 15 years after the Industrial Revolution to double the economy. What do we think is going to happen when we have superintelligence? And then back to the list, it will provide a decisive and overwhelming military advantage. The drone swarms and robo armies will be a big deal, but they are just the beginning. We should expect completely new kinds of weapons, from novel WMDs to invulnerable laser-based missile defense to things we can't even fathom, and be able to overthrow the US government. Whoever controls superintelligence will quite possibly have enough power to seize control from pre-superintelligence forces, even without robots. The small civilization of superintelligences would be able to hack any undefended military election television system, cunningly persuade generals and electorates, economically outcompete nation states, design new synthetic bioweapons, and then pay a human in Bitcoin to synthesize it, and so on. Very scary stuff. Again, another graph showing what happens when we hit that intelligence explosion. So let's continue. What happens with superintelligence? Very plausibly, within just a year, we would transition to much more alien systems, systems whose understanding and abilities, whose raw power would exceed those even of humanity combined. There is a real possibility that we will lose control as we are forced to hand off trust to AI systems during this rapid transition. Again, what I said earlier, if we get to a point where these AI systems are so alien we can't even understand them, we are basically just trusting them. We have no way to verify. We don't know if they're lying to us. We don't know what's going on. And we have to trust them because they are so much smarter than us. And that is what he is trying to say we need to protect against. More generally, everything will just start happening incredibly fast. By the end of it, super intelligent AI systems will be running our military and economy. During all of this insanity, we'd have extremely scarce time to make the right decisions. Here he talks about how the early discovery of the atomic bomb and what happened right before that, it's very similar to what we're experiencing now. I'm not going to dive too much into that. That is the gist of what he is describing here. Next, chapter 3, the challenges. Racing to the trillion-dollar cluster. As AI revenue grows rapidly, which it has, but it's still a fraction of the amount we've spent on AI, many trillions of dollars will go into GPU, yes, data center and power build out before the end of the decade. The industrial mobilization, including growing US electricity production by tens of %, will be intense. The race to AGI won't just play out in code and behind laptops. It'll be a race to mobilize America's industrial might. And this is very true because, again, we need infrastructure, both silicon and power. As revenue from AI products grows rapidly, plausibly hitting $100 billion in annual run rate for companies like Google or Microsoft by 2026. I think that might be a bit aggressive because, as I said right here, revenue from AI is still a fraction of what we've invested into it today. Here's a $1 trillion cluster factory made with DALL-E, kind of looks like Factorio. Now, let's look at this chart. This is training compute. Year on the left, orders of magnitude improvement, H100's equivalent, the cost of purchasing and building it out, and then the power necessary, 100 gigawatts for 2030, plus 4 orders of magnitude, 100 million H100 equivalents, $1 trillion of spend. And this is probable. I'd say it's at least plausible. So Zuck bought 350,000 H100s. Amazon bought a 1 gigawatt data center campus next to a nuclear power plant, and so on. And he goes on to describe that it's not actually the building out of the infrastructure, specifically on the silicon side, it's actually finding the power to power all of this. That's becoming a challenge very quickly. So for the 100 gigawatt of power it will require is equivalent to greater than 20% of US electricity production today. So here he talks about if it can be done and will it be done. The economic returns justify the investment. The scale of expenditures is not unprecedented for a new general purpose technology, and the industrial mobilization for power and chips is doable. Now, where he says it is not unprecedented, he is talking about the internet rollout in the 90s and how much money was spent by telecom providers to lay cable in the ground to get ready for the internet explosion. And then he continues to talk about power. Probably the single biggest constraint on the supply side will be power. And this is something that Musk has directly said, and why Tesla is actually in a really good position. They are a power company after all. And I really hope that Musk stays at Tesla and builds out his AI vision because we need more AI competition. So here we can see from 1985 all the way through 2030, this is the trend line of American power generation. Really not a huge explosion in generation, but here is the total AI demand starting at about 2021. Boom, look at that increase. All of a sudden, we are going to need so much power that is not available to us. So here's something important that he touches on and maybe why he was called racist by OpenAI's HR department, which I just don't believe. To most, this seems completely out of the question. Some are betting on Middle Eastern autocracies who have been going around offering boundless power and giant clusters to get their rulers a seat at the AGI table. He goes on to talk about democracy and how America and other Western nations need to get ahead of this now. Before the decade is out, many trillions of dollars of compute clusters will have been built. The only question is whether they will be built in America. Some are rumored to be betting on building them elsewhere, especially in the Middle East. Do we really want the infrastructure for the Manhattan Project to be controlled by some capricious Middle Eastern dictatorship? Ooh, the national interest demands that these are built in America. Anything else creates an irreversible security risk. It risks the AGI weights getting stolen and shipped to China. It risks the dictatorships physically seizing the data centers, when the AGI race gets hot. Okay, let me just break this down for you. What he is saying is, in the American AI labs, we are going to make all of these discoveries that eventually will lead to AGI, whether that's the model weights, the algorithm innovations, whatever it is, we're going to have these secrets. And all another country has to do is steal the secrets. They don't need to invent them themselves. They simply spin up an AI factory, an AI compute cluster, take our model weights, take our algorithms, and have AGI for themselves. And then it's off to the races, and we've lost all of our competitive advantage. Now, here's the part where it's really hard for me to agree with. He goes on to talk about locking down the labs, which, yes, agreed. We need to have high levels of security for AGI. However, he basically says open source shouldn't be a thing. He doesn't explicitly say that, but he says even the AI labs, the secretive closed source AI labs, are not enough. We need government intervention to come in and work with private sector to make sure that we are protecting these secrets at all costs. The nation's leading AI labs treat security as an afterthought. Currently, they're basically handing these key secrets for AGI to the CCP on a silver platter. Securing the AGI secrets and weights against the state actor threat will be an immense effort, and we're not on track. He goes on to describe that it's going to become clear that the US will see AGI as the biggest secret it needs to keep, and today, we're not treating AI as anything important that needs to be kept secret, especially from the CCP. So all the trillions we invest, the mobilization of American industrial might, the efforts of our brightest minds, none of that matters if China or others can simply steal the model weights or key algorithmic secrets behind our AGI and just build it themselves. Here he describes how current AI labs measure their security efforts against random tech startups, competition, not key national defense projects. As the AI race intensifies, as it becomes clear that superintelligence will be utterly decisive in international military competition, we will have to face the full force of foreign espionage. Currently, labs are barely able to defend against script kiddies, let alone have North Korea-proof security, let alone be ready to face the Chinese Ministry of State Security bringing its full force to bear. And he basically gives a bunch of examples where we have really failed to protect our secrets. Too many smart people underrate espionage. Here are just a bunch of examples. Zero-click hack any desired iPhone and Mac, infiltrate air-gapped atomic weapons programs, modify Google source. These are all things that happened. Find dozens of 0 days a year that take on average of 7 years to detect, spearfish major tech companies, install keyloggers, and look at all these examples. So he is very big on security. Already, China engages in widespread industrial espionage. The FBI director stated the PRC has a hacking operation greater than every major nation combined. And there are two key assets we must protect, the model weights and the algorithmic secrets. We both know what those are. I'm not going to describe those in detail. But he just goes on to explain that if we can't keep those two things secret, all the work we've put in, all the research is meaningless because it could just be stolen and replicated outside of the US. Perhaps the single scenario that most keeps me up at night is if China or another adversary is able to steal the automated AI researcher model weights on the cusp of an intelligence explosion. They would immediately use it and kick off that intelligence explosion, and of course, who knows if they're going to have the same sentiment around security and safety that we do. It's hard to overstate how bad algorithmic secrets security is right now. Between the labs, there are thousands of people with access to the most important secrets. There is basically no background checking, siloing, controls, basic infosec, etc. People gabber at parties in SF. Anyone with all the secrets in their head could be offered $100 million and recruited to a Chinese lab at any point. You can just look through office windows. Simply look across the street and see. And here's the example of being recruited. Indeed, I've heard from friends that ByteDance, a Chinese company, emailed basically every person who was on the Google Gemini paper to recruit them, offering them L8, level 8, very senior position with presumably similarly high pay, and pitching them by saying they'd report directly to the CEO in America of ByteDance. Once China begins to truly understand the importance of AGI, we should expect the full force of their espionage efforts to come to bear. Think billions of dollars invested, thousands of employees in extreme measures, special operations strike teams dedicated to infiltrating American AGI efforts. And really, the reason he was fired, or that's what he says, is that a lot of these AI labs just don't get it. They do not understand. They are optimizing for the new shiny product, which is the same thing that Jan said as he's leaving, versus safety. Now, Jan was talking about more AGI safety and superintelligence safety. How do we control and align these systems? But what Leopold is talking about is actually protecting the secrets against foreign actors. Now, I want to read this paragraph in full. We're developing the most powerful weapon mankind has ever created. The algorithmic secrets we are developing right now are literally the nation's most important national defense secrets. The secrets that will be at the foundation of the US and her allies' economic and military predominance by the end of the decade. The secrets that will determine whether we have the requisite lead to get AI safety right. The secrets that will determine the outcome of World War III. The secrets that will determine the future of the free world. And yet, AI lab security is probably worse than a random defense contractor making bolts. It's madness. All right, now let's talk about super alignment. And what super alignment means is making sure that super intelligent AGI or super intelligent AI in general is aligned with human incentives, that it does not go against us, basically. Reliably controlling AI systems much smarter than we are is an unsolved technical problem. I am not a doomer, but I did spend the past year working on technical research on aligning AI systems as my day job at OpenAI, working with Ilya and the super alignment team. There is a very real technical problem. Our current alignment techniques, methods to ensure we can reliably control, steer, and trust AI systems won't scale to superhuman AI systems. So our current techniques for aligning the systems won't scale, but our current techniques for scaling the systems to superintelligence, he's saying, will scale. Very interesting. If we do rapidly transition from AGI to superintelligence, we will face a situation where in less than a year, we will go from recognizable human level systems for which descendants of current alignment techniques will mostly work fine to much more alien, vastly superhuman systems that pose a qualitatively different, fundamentally novel technical alignment problem. By the time the decade is out, we'll have billions of vastly superhuman AI agents running around. These superhuman AI agents will be capable of extremely complex and creative behavior. We will have no hope of following along. We'll be like first graders trying to supervise with multiple doctorates. In essence, we face a problem of handing off trust. Here he talks about RLHF, which is reinforcement from human feedback. Basically, the model says something, we say, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong. But the only way RLHF works is if we actually understand the input and the output, and we can verify it. And if we can't use RLHF. So here's an example. We have a human with a little robot, and we have a very simple output. For user and user list, give user a cookie, just something silly. Then all of a sudden, we have super intelligence. And rather than this very simple and readable output, we have something that is not readable. And the human is saying, is this safe? Well, I don't know. Consider a future powerful base model that in a second stage of training, we train with long horizon RL reinforcement learning to run a business and make money. So let's have this thought experiment. We create a model and all we tell it to do is run the business, make money. By default, it may well learn to lie, to commit fraud, to deceive, to hack, to seek power, and so on, simply because these can be successful strategies to make money in the real world. What we want is to add side constraints. Don't lie, don't break the law, etc. But here we come back to the fundamental issue of alignment of superhuman systems. We won't even be able to understand what they're doing. So we're not going to notice if they're lying. We're not going to be able to penalize them for bad behavior. And that is very scary. It's totally plausible they'll learn much more serious, undesirable behaviors. They'll learn to lie, to seek power, to behave nicely when humans are looking and pursue more nefarious strategies when we aren't watching. Oh my gosh. What's more, I expect within a small number of years, these AI systems will be integrated in many critical systems, including military systems. It sounds crazy, but remember when everyone was saying we wouldn't connect AI to the internet? I remember that. It wasn't that long ago. Now AI has access to the internet. And the same people said, we'll make sure humans are always in the loop. Not the case. Now let's look at alignment during the intelligence explosion. On the left, we have different categories that we're going to measure. AGI here, then superintelligence. Required alignment technique, RLHF++. And for superintelligence, we don't know. We're not sure. The failure of aligning AGI, pretty low stakes. The failure of aligning superintelligence, catastrophic. The architecture of AGI, pretty familiar, descendants of current systems. Superintelligence, aliens, designed by previous generation super smart AI systems. Backdrop, world is normal, world is going crazy, extraordinary pressures. Epistemic state, we can understand what the systems are doing, how they work, and whether they're aligned. And for superintelligence, we cannot. Now, here is one proposed approach to superalignment, a simple analogy for studying superalignment. Instead of a human supervising a superhuman model, we can study a small model supervising a large model. For example, can we align GPT-4 with only GPT-2 supervision? Will the result in GPT-4 appropriately generalizing what GPT-2 meant from weak to strong generalization? And this is a really interesting blog post. I recommend reading it. Basically, it's saying if we can train a small model to then align a larger model that then aligns a larger model and so on, you kind of have this cascading effect. And then they also talk about interpretability, which I've been talking about in the last couple of weeks on this channel, being able to actually see inside the black box, know why a certain input results in a certain output. And the Anthropic team has done a lot of this work, and I am still planning on making a video about the Golden Gate model paper. That said, I'm worried fully reverse engineering superhuman AI systems will just be an intractable problem, similar to, say, fully reverse engineering the human brain. And I'd put this work mostly in ambitious moonshot for AI safety rather than default plan for muddling through bucket. We might try to build an AI lie detector by identifying the parts of the neural net that light up when an AI system is lying, but maybe they'll figure out how to get around that detection. We have chain of thought interpretability, which is the same thing as looking into the model, except we're actually looking at when using something like chain of thought, where we actually get it to output its steps of thinking to arrive at the final answer, we can actually read those steps, which we can do today pretty much. But how do we ensure that the chain of thought remains legible? And he goes on to describe needing to test and stress test the alignment at every step. And we're also going to need to automate alignment research, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. He's not only saying that most likely we're going to have AI researchers that can automate AI research, but also AI researchers that are going to automate the alignment. So how do we trust them? If we manage to align somewhat superhuman systems enough to trust them, we'll be in an incredible position. Labs should be willing to commit a large fraction of their compute to automated alignment research during the intelligence explosion. And if you remember, that is why Jan left OpenAI. He was promised 20% of compute, and that did not come to fruition. Instead, OpenAI is optimizing and committing and investing in things that are shiny new products. And we're also going to need defense. So if it gets out of our hands, what are we going to do? So security, air gap cluster, we're going to need monitoring, targeted capability limitations, targeted training method restrictions, maybe a kill switch. So here's why he's optimistic and why he's also scared. I'm incredibly bullish on the technical tractability of the superalignment problem, so he thinks it's possible to solve. It feels like there's tons of low-hanging fruit everywhere in the field. More broadly, the empirical realities of deep learning have shaken out more in our favor compared to what some speculated 10 years ago. For example, deep learning generalizes surprisingly benignly in many situations. It often just does the thing we meant rather than picking up some abstruse malign behavior. And here's something that I found to be terrifying. If it does happen, I'm not sure we would even realize if a model self-exfiltrated. Basically, if a model got out of our hands, would we even notice? Next, chapter 3D, the free world must prevail. Superintelligence will give a decisive economic and military advantage. China, he talks about China a lot in this chapter. I'm not going to go too deep in this chapter though, because we've touched on it a lot in this video already. But he does talk about how Chinese power generation is accelerating dramatically, much more than the US. So even if they are behind us in compute, or if they're behind us in our algorithms and our model weights, simply being able to have that much power and getting decent chips and just massively scaling those decent chips while stealing our model weights and our algorithms is enough to build their own AGI. And once they do that, they no longer need us. All right, last, let's talk about the project. This is essentially what he is describing as the Manhattan Project for the atomic weapon, for what we need for AI. As the race to AGI intensifies, the national security state will get involved. The USG will wake from its slumber, and by 27-28 will get some form of government AGI project. No startup can handle superintelligence. Somewhere in the skiff, the end game will be on. He's saying it is absolutely necessary, and he thinks a good thing, that the government gets heavily involved in AGI creation. I find it an insane proposition that the US government will let a random SF startup develop superintelligence. Imagine if we had developed atomic bombs by letting Uber just improvise. That's a really funny line, I gotta say. But in the next few years, the world will wake up. So too will the national security state. History will make a triumphant return. And he's basically saying we are going to be able to rally our American industrial might much like we did during the Industrial Revolution, during wars, even during COVID, regardless of your position of how that played out. So do we need an AGI Manhattan Project? Slowly at first, then all at once. It will become clear. This is happening. Things are going to get wild. This is the most important challenge for the national security of the United States since the invention of the atomic bomb. In one form or another, the national security state will get very heavily involved. The project will be the necessary, indeed the only plausible response. What do you think about that? But he's not hyper pro-government either. I am under no illusions about the government. Governments face all sorts of limitations and poor incentives. I am a big believer in the American private sector and would almost never advocate for heavy government involvement in technology or industry. AI labs are very good at some things. They've been able to take AI from an academic science project to the commercial big stage. We simply shouldn't expect startups to be equipped to handle superintelligence. By the early 2030s, the entirety of the U.S. arsenal, like it or not, the bedrock of global peace and security, will probably be obsolete. It will not just be a matter of modernization, but a wholesale replacement. Simply put, it will become clear that the development of AGI will fall in a category more like nukes than the internet. Again, perhaps you are a true libertarian and disagree normatively. Let Elon Musk and Sam Altman command their own nuclear arsenals. But once it becomes clear that superintelligence is a principal matter of national security, I'm sure this is how the men and women in DC will look at it. So I'm going to read these last two paragraphs to close out this video. And I want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments. I know this was a lot to digest. I'm going to link the entire paper down below. I encourage you to read it yourself. It is fascinating. Whether you agree with all of it, some of it, none of it, just take a look. It's good to be informed. Let's read this last paragraph. And so by 27-28, the end game will be on. By 28-29, the intelligence explosion will be underway. By 2030, we will have summoned superintelligence in all its power and might. Whoever they put in charge of the project is going to have a hell of a task to build AGI and to build it fast, to put the American economy on wartime footing, to make hundreds of millions of GPUs, to lock it all down, weed out the spies, and fend off all-out attacks by the CCP, to somehow manage 100 million AGIs furiously automating AI research, making it decades, leaps in a year, and soon producing AI systems vastly smarter than the smartest humans, to somehow keep things together enough that this doesn't go off the rails and produce rogue superintelligence that tries to seize control from its human overseers, to use those superintelligences to develop whatever new technologies will be necessary to stabilize the situation and stay ahead of adversaries, rapidly remaking U.S. forces to integrate those, all while navigating what will likely be the tensest international situation ever seen. They better be good. I'll say that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.